on Sky News. Now, we're getting straight to discussing the climate issues of the day now with Dr. Cece Hu from the University of Oxford's Environmental Change Institute and Richard Black, Senior Associate at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. So good to see you both. Good evening. So let's talk about the spectacular pictures today of Scotland's last coal-fired power station being demolished. And coal is very close to complete extinction, in fact, in the UK. But this country, like most others, continues to rely on other fossil fuels, mainly oil and gas, for energy. But there's pressure to reduce that in a bid to cut emissions and slow climate change. And this week's the UK's oil and gas strategy was challenged in court by campaigners. And Richard, what was this court case all about? And is litigation generally likely to have some sort of influence on speeding up our transition towards renewables, do you think?
Yes, this court case was brought by a group called Paid to Pollute. And the basis of their case is that basically if you look at the way that the oil and gas industry intersects with the Treasury, some years it ends up paying tax net to the Treasury, other years it ends up taking tax net from the Treasury. So the plaintiffs in this case are basically arguing that in the years when it actually receives money, this is a perverse incentive. Effectively, it's paying oil companies to get stuff out of the ground. At the very time when scientists and various other analyses are basically saying we shouldn't be getting so much oil and gas out of the ground. In fact, we shouldn't be doing any more exploration and development if we are just to have, enough fossil fuels that can keep us below the 1.5 Celsius limit. So they had the hearing yesterday, and we should be getting a judgment maybe tomorrow, maybe in a week or two.
And Richard, briefly, I mean, there are court cases around the world. Are they making a difference to government policies?
I think some have made a big difference. The big one was the Urgenda court case brought against the Dutch government a couple of years back, which really forced the government to accelerate its carbon cutting pledges. But often the court cases raise publicity about an issue, and that can be as useful in the long run as actually winning. And that, I think, is probably the case with this Paid to Pollute one that we're seeing. The subsidy regime is quite murky, and this will I think, shine some light upon it.
Cece, what do you think? Do you think that this is basically down to governments making decisions about transitioning away from fossil fuels, or can other influences be important, like public pressure, for example?
Yeah, I think these cases are a perfect demonstration of people power, right? I think people power can be very strong and effective, but the challenge that we face is how can we scale people power? I think basically we don't just want one successful case or two successful cases. We want lots of cases and lots of individual actions. And the trouble with that is that, it's hard to scale people power. But I think one of the key issues that we need to address in this challenge is that we need to really make this mental linkage between climate change, which is a very abstract concept, with individual lives. And, how does climate change reduce food on your tables? How does climate change stop your children from going to school? Once every individual has made that mental link, I mean, I struggle with it sometimes too, even after studying climate change for so many years. Once people have made that mental link between that abstract concept and their daily lives, then they can make really individual changes. They can all be their organizations, they can all be their workplaces, they can all be their governments.
Okay.
So I think the scale...
Sorry to cut you off, Cece, but just a quick word on that issue with Richard, because the government might say, well, yes, but we need to worry about energy security. That relates to people. They might worry about getting a steady supply of electricity. People in the fossil fuel industry will worry about their jobs. I mean, people can relate to that too. The transition has to be managed carefully, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And we've seen examples, of course, in the UK of how not to do it with the phase out of coal mining going back several decades. That was a really disruptive and very unfair transition. Germany, Chile, other countries are moving off of coal via other routes, basically consultations with mining communities, working out what support they need in order to get through this. But I think it's also important to look at the overall scale of likely job losses. If you compare the size of the workforce in the UK oil and gas industry, for example, it's nothing compared with the number of workers in retail who've lost their jobs over the last 10, 20 years as online retailing has become a thing. So yes, let's have a transition, and a just transition, but actually really let's make it a genuine transition.
OK, let's move on to our next topic. And earlier in the show, we heard how some traditional trees could disappear from the British countryside forever as changing weather patterns are creating ideal conditions for diseases to spread. The National Trust says it's trying to build woodlands that are more resilient to our changing climate. But is enough being done to protect the world's natural solutions? And Cece, I know you've done a lot of work on adaptation. I mean, how important a role can nature play in those projects trying to mitigate against the effects of climate change?
Yeah, sure. So there are many nature-based solutions, such as one can build rain gardens or green roofs or permeable roads, and these are roads basically that absorb a lot of water. In terms of, I actually like to highlight an initiative which is happening in China right now, which is a country that I study quite a bit. The government has launched a 1 trillion investment in this initiative called the Sponge City Initiative, but basically it's finding new ways of building city surfaces and roads which will absorb water that stops from floods, and it's like a new way of kind of constructing cities. And by 2030, the government is actually aiming to have 80% of its urban areas to be sponge-like. So these cities will absorb water, flood water, in essence, very quickly. And there are some preliminary results that are showing that the investment in these kind of resilience programs are yielding up to 20 times investment returns. So it's really worth investing in this kind of resilient programs because they give you a lot of avoided damages.
Cece, very briefly, I mean, we were hearing about the National Trust warning about diseases in trees. The problem is, though, that climate change might affect some of those nature-based solutions, mightn't they? Very briefly, if you can.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, trees are the lungs of the planets, right? We need to protect them. So I think one nature-based solution is to not kind of plant more trees. And in fact, a study has shown if you plant 1 trillion trees, we can have the potential to save the planet, at least to keep our global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. It has the potential to destroy, but we need to protect trees.
OK, very quickly, Richard, I mean, obviously nature plays a big part in mitigating against the effects of climate change, but it can be affected deeply by it as well.
Yes, and we need to understand that for all kinds of reasons. We rely upon nature, for a lot of the food that we eat. We rely on, we need healthy soil, we need insect pollinators and all of these things. We know that wildlife is shifting its ranges and in response to climate change, we need to understand that and adapt to it because basically we need to, humanity to be able to survive well, in the nature of 40, 50 years' time as well as it does now.
We're out of time. I'm so sorry to keep cutting in. We were short of time, but Cece and Richard, always good to talk to you both. Thanks very much.